The world has obviously changed as a result of coronavirus. The challenges we face today may not be the challenges we face tomorrow. In fact, some of the changes that coronavirus will bring to society may not be understood for some years. Certainly the economic effects of coronavirus may stay with us long after a vaccine is ready and we've stopped the pandemic from doing further harm to society from a health perspective. But when we want to try and get a frame of reference for how this might change our existence, or how other crises might change our existence, we do have some historical analogies to look at. The first example of that, of course, is the Black Plague. It wrought havoc on the communities of Europe in the Middle Ages with, in some estimates, reduction of population in some cities by more than half of the population. But it changed society's structure pretty radically. Most of the wealthy, of course, lived in cities and so were exposed to greater risk. Sanitation was poor at that time, and so the Black Plague, the virus associated with it, spread throughout those communities rapidly. People living on farms, labourers outside of the city, fared a little better. So after the dust settled from the Black Plague, many of those labourers were able to move into city accommodations. Labour rates went up. It was a real levelling of society. Now, prior to this, this was a feudal system in the Middle Ages in Europe in particular. There was a great disparity between the rich and the poor. And so the plague was somewhat of an equalizer in this respect. Salaries or wages for labourers went up, and those changes became long-term changes from a societal structure. One of the ironic side effects of this was that the labourers who now had more wealth started to buy new clothes and new possessions. And so the rich, wealthy elite in Europe at the time put in place sumptuary laws. These sumptuary laws were meant to indicate that you kept your social standing. So overt shows of wealth with your clothing was illegal if you weren't part of the rich elite class. So some pretty radical changes. We remember the Black Plague today through social memory, nursery rhymes like ring-a-rosy, a pocket full of posies, and other stories we have throughout that we remember from these times. When you sneeze and someone says, "Bless you," this is some social muscle memory from the pandemic of the Black Plague. When the Spanish flu hit the world in 1918 and 1919, it devastated, again, societies as a result of this pandemic. Coming out of the Spanish flu, major changes occurred to the US healthcare system. So the big changes that occurred, the most notable change, was the creation of a national health scheme and national hospitals being funded publicly for the first time. Prior to the Spanish flu, public hospitals that existed were mainly for hospice care, palliative care, for those with terminal illness or long-term illnesses. For most people, if they had surgery requirements or they were sick, they would get that catered for within the community by a doctor who also doubled as a surgeon. This organised healthcare system that emerged out of the Spanish flu, the modern healthcare system we see today, was as a result of the devastating effects of the Spanish flu. So are we going to see more healthcare changes as a result of COVID-19? Undoubtedly. There's behavioural changes that we're already seeing. We're seeing people use cash to buy goods and services a lot less. We see physical interactions in stores threatened by these changes. We see JCPenney filing for bankruptcy and other companies under pressure as a result of changing behaviour. Whether these changes become permanent is a question, but certainly for many people, their use of the online world, purchasing groceries, ordering food from restaurants, for many people, the first time they used these technologies was during the coronavirus. And so we've seen an online boom in sales of things online. Amazon's results for the first quarter were up 26% year on year, their highest growth quarter ever in the last few years. And undoubtedly, during the second quarter, we're going to see further increases there. Players in China like Dingdong Maicai saw a 500% increase in their online grocery business as a result of coronavirus. But there's some changes that we wouldn't have expected would have got past the starters block that have come out as a result of coronavirus. For example, we know Andrew Yang, who was running for the running in the presidential primaries, for the Democratic primaries rather. He was proposing a universal basic income model. He called it the freedom dividend. And while that didn't get him selected as the candidate for the Democrats, certainly we have seen the dismissal of UBI as a potential mechanism for the economy weakened as a result of the coronavirus. More people are willing to consider such things. You know, the surplus payments that we had, that the US government levied, this would have been considered unthinkable back in 2019, just a few months earlier. Spain has announced that they will permanently move to a universal basic income model. Now, as we go to air, we're coming off the back of these extended protests around the Black Lives Matter, the death of George Floyd, and so forth that have occurred in history, in society during this time. Now, while these protests and the riots and curfews that resulted in the United States seem like they're happening with an intensity that is unusual, the reality is the data shows us that for some years now, certainly since the 1980s, we've seen a gradual increase in the level and intensity of protests globally. This sort of signals the fact that from a broad societal perspective, people have not been happy, whether it's the protests of the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, protests against Trump's election when he was elected, and the Black Lives Matter, climate change protests, all of these things. We've seen this sort of intensity rising around these protests. You can see from this illustration of this GIF how the intensity of these protests have been global as well. They haven't been limited to certain democracies. So why is it that we see this increase in protests around the world at a time when you'd think people would be hiding in their homes as a result of fears around coronavirus? Why has that fear, other fear have prompted them to get out and protest amidst this pandemic? Well, the biggest underlying issue that is generating this activity from a global perspective over this multi-decade change is systemic inequality. We see in the United States, we have the highest levels of inequality ever recorded throughout history. Depending on which rankings you use, the US is either 93rd or 125th in terms of income equality in the global scheme of things. So this is creating obvious pressure on the system. This level of inequality doesn't go unnoticed. In historical terms, when we look at what others have had to say about this, these levels of inequality we see generally result in some sort of large-scale systemic change on the political sphere. Socioeconomic changes and so forth wrought by policy changes or even revolution. Now, when we look at this underlying inequality, how is that and how is coronavirus going to accentuate those issues moving forward? Well, one of the biggest issues facing the United States is homelessness. When you look around the US today, on a 40-hour working week on minimum wage, a family cannot afford a 2-bedroom home anywhere in the United States. The other obvious impact is the healthcare system. Now, obviously in the United States, there's a lot of debate about the healthcare system, but this underlying inequality we have, it really accentuates the problem of access to healthcare. So 2/3 of all bankruptcies in the United States, it's estimated, are result, in part at least, from medical expenses. The cost of healthcare on an inflation-adjusted basis since the 1970s has gone up for individuals up by more than 720%. And from a GDP perspective, it's gone up from 2% of GDP in the 1980s to today 10% of GDP. So rising healthcare costs are a systemic problem that we haven't yet solved. Certainly universal healthcare, access to healthcare for all, is something that still evades the United States. So looking at all of these factors and looking at the fact that within just 21 days, the US economy was in freefall. We had massive collapse of the stock market, the greatest since the Depression, and the longest run and the steepest growth in unemployment since the Depression. In fact, in many measures, much worse. We'd never had prior to coronavirus where we'd lost more than 1 million people out of the labour market in a single week. But that milestone was met early in coronavirus, and in fact, it peaked at over 2 million people a week being left out of the job market. Now, this has resulted in 40 million people being unemployed in the United States, near 20% of the US population unemployed right now. So this inequality we see is also clear when we look at the impact on various communities in the United States. It's clear that capitalism really didn't have the mechanisms to be able to sustain itself through this crisis. While the market is up again at the moment, this disconnect or decoupling from the actual economy shows that we've really got to rethink how capitalism works for the benefit of those in society. Certainly with problem issues like healthcare issues and access to education, access to housing, core basic needs of the citizenry, then capitalism isn't doing its job when faced with a crisis like coronavirus. Now, historically, when we look at how these changes have occurred and how society has handled these changes, we see that various models of political and socio-economic organisation have fared better than others in different respects. But throughout the vast majority of history, when you look back through, for example, Lessons of History from Will Durant, we see that the vast majority of the time, humans lived under a type of feudal system where the rich elite controlled the assets and wealth of the economy. For roughly 90% of human history, that's been the case. And so this is what we call a pyramid-shaped economy, with the wealth flowing uphill to the 1%. These systems have dominated socio-economic organisation over history. But actually the most productive economies throughout history are those that Will Durant classified as having a diamond shape. So this is with a very strong, robust middle class, very good income equality and wealth distribution. These economies, such as the post-Second World War economy of the United States, have been vastly more successful from a perspective of economic growth, innovation, and happiness, and meeting the needs of citizens than those economies we saw in the past that weren't geared towards that more on that pyramid-shaped model. So when we look at the effects of coronavirus, one of the key issues is the fact that it produced massive long-term economic uncertainty. Some would argue that even the populist movement and the rise of characters like Trump and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson and so forth were really due to this underlying economic uncertainty. People were concerned about their future, concerned about access to employment, concerned that immigrants were taking their jobs. This economic uncertainty is set, unfortunately, to continue. Now, coronavirus has given us a glimpse of what life might be like over the next 50 years as we deal with subsequent crises that will affect us economically and affect and accentuate the issues of inequality. So while we have pandemic today, there are other possible pandemics that might emerge in the future that will have a similar effect to coronavirus. But the displacement of workers in the labour force by artificial intelligence or technology-based unemployment is probably the next big crisis and potentially has more economic impact than coronavirus has had. And then, of course, let's not forget climate change. The impact of climate change on society threatens even greater disruption to society. So the fact is, if it wasn't coronavirus, something else would have identified that the system we have, the system based around the current model of capitalism and the current organising principles of society, are basically not shockproof for these type of crises. So let's look at those two emerging threats to economic order, namely artificial intelligence and climate change. When we talk about artificial intelligence, obviously this is going to provide a massive boom to the economy, particularly in the tech sector. But what we've noticed throughout the coronavirus is it's become clear that the tech giants that have led the growth in the stock market over the last decade or so, these companies aren't necessarily geared towards social goals. They're geared towards commercial goals like much of the rest of the market. But if we allow AI to disrupt employment without having a social conscience, then in the United States, for example, up to half of the jobs that we have in the US today could be affected or displaced by artificial intelligence. Now, there's a very simple reason why that is and why AI represents a significant structural change that we have to plan for, that we can't just leave to chance or hope that it's not as impactful on jobs as we may have first thought. When we look at Economics 101, one of the key principles in Adam Smith economics, Keynesian economics over the past 100 years or more has been that when demand increases, this necessitates an increase of supply serviced by increased participation in the labour market. So we've always understood that as economic activity picks up, then more jobs will be created. So right now, we hear a lot of debate about how quickly jobs are going to recover as a result of economic activity in the United States, for example. The real core problem with artificial intelligence is it decouples supply from the labour market. So if you have high levels of automation in society, you don't need a lot of human workers to be able to meet the demand. Demand can be met by autonomous algorithms. It can be met by robots. It can be met by automated factories that aren't necessarily required to have human workers in the fray. This is a major restructuring of the way we think about the economy. And unless we deal with this, this will result in a permanent shift to the pyramid-shaped economies where inequality is a feature of that disparity. The other obvious angle is, and we've seen this debate occurring through coronavirus times as well, is that education that we have today, the education system, is not a good fit for this future. So we see a lot of uncertainty around the sort of education that we need to give our children to make them future-proof for these changes in society. Working with robots, working with AIs, these types of issues are clear, but we can't be training them for the sort of jobs that AI is going to take. We need to create new opportunities for employment, think about new job opportunities. Now, let's get to the bigger problem, climate change. Within the next 30 to 50 years, we're going to see major impact of climate change on the entire world. This is not going to just affect one economy, it's going to affect the global economy. Unless we start mitigating that risk, unless we start planning for those disruptions brought about by climate change, the impact could be even more severe than artificial intelligence. And don't forget that the impact of AI on society economically could be even more disruptive than what we've seen with coronavirus. So this cycle of crises will continue unless we figure out a better way to do this. What are some of the immediate effects that climate change could have on the economy? Well, the first is coastal sea rise. We know that about 300 million people could be displaced by coastal sea rise over the next 30 years. That's a big change, but we'll start to see the effects of that already in the next decade or so. The concern about coronavirus obviously is warranted, but we're going to see potentially new pandemics coming out of glacial melts and permafrost as a result of global warming as well. So more ancient viruses could be exposed to the world, creating similar pandemics to what we've seen with coronavirus. So we need to now start preparing our pandemic response much better than we had obviously during the times of coronavirus. The potential for food insecurity is also high. We have whole regions of the planet right now that are farming regions that are going to be under stress as a result of climate change and temperature increases. Now, while some argue that it's going to be okay because these farming bands, these areas of land that are used to farm, will just shift to a new location where the farming can continue, you still have a massive shift as a result of supply chain changes. You still have people who are in those old farming areas where the crops can no longer grow, really at risk of economic displacement there. So any effect of this on farming is going to be severe. Even it's expected 90% of crops in the Bordeaux region of France that produce wine could be failures over the next 5 years as a result of these small temperature changes we've seen as a result of global warming. So food insecurity is going to be a big issue. We're going to have to really rethink our approach to farming. The other aspect, of course, of inundating coastal cities and low-lying countries like Bangladesh, as an example, with rising sea levels, is that these continuous flooding systems will create mass migration of affected communities. So, if you think the immigration trend from Syria as a result of the civil war there is an issue, think about that happening on a global basis with 300 million people displaced. It's going to have to change the way we think. It's going to have to change the organizing principles of society. So at the heart of it, we now need to think about capitalism that's reformed. Capitalism with a social conscience. Capitalism that can work to absorb these shocks in the system rather than accentuate them like the US economy did during coronavirus. So how might we go about rethinking capitalism for this new world with these constant potential crises? Well, one good illustration is how we would design society from scratch using a first principles approach to the economy. If we are successful at putting humans on Mars over the next decade or two, setting up the first city on Mars, as Elon Musk wants to do, what sort of organizing principles would we have for that society? Various science fiction writers and futurists have written about this possibility. And one of the really interesting models emerged from a trilogy written by an author called Kim Stanley Robinson on the colonization of Mars. Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars was the trilogy of books. But in that, he proposed that the sole goal of the economy on Mars was to be prosperous, to be sustainable, to be independent of the Earth for supplying them with their needs. So what sort of society would build around that organizing principle of sustainable prosperity? Well, it turned out that you'd have to have a very different view of money. Money became unimportant. When your core needs, getting access to food, water and air, were your core needs, currency was an afterthought in this respect. And so out of this became an organizing principle in this sci-fi world where people had this approach of what he called eco-poetic cooperation. So to build sustainable prosperity, you need to have a view of putting more back into the system than you take out of it. So people were seen as wealthy if they could generate more energy into the system, put more resources back into the system than those who were a drain on the system, taking more resources out. And this was a very different, this is obviously a very different viewpoint from the type of economics we have today. But we do have some great news. Technology is really at the heart of the solution. We have the ability to produce very cheap energy. Solar is far cheaper than we anticipated just a few years ago, and as we increase storage, cheap energy is going to be a feature of this new system. We can use that to create a better environment for us and increase wealth. Homelessness, well, we can now 3D print a home for around $3,000 in 24 hours. So all we really need today is the organising will, that social conscience, to be able to prevent homelessness in society. We have a whole range of new technologies that are going to help us from a healthcare perspective, whether it's gene therapy, changing our genome to eradicate certain diseases, whether it's rapid production of vaccines and testing, or real-time sensors that we wear on our body or even ingest to be able to monitor our healthcare. The future of healthcare becomes real-time, one of prevention rather than treating symptoms. Food supply. We have a range of technologies now that we can lever, such as robotics and so forth, that make farming much more efficient and predictable. But we're even moving farms into cities, using vertical farms and so forth like that, to solve some of the supply chain problems with food that we've had on a historical basis. And we're changing the way we think about food. So we're now producing meat in a lab. Before long, the cost of this meat will, in factory production terms, will be much lower than meat farmed on the out in the fields. So this is a radical shift, but it changes supply chain. It changes the way we think about this. We've seen a real shift around education during coronavirus. Schooling from home, working from home, these behaviours are likely to become more permanent as we see that there's not a real benefit in having people gather in office spaces or schools. While this will have obviously an effect on commercial real estate, it's also going to impact the way we think about education. The good news out of this is we can have very high quality education provided to students just through access to the internet. So basic digital access is key. So where do we land with all of this? Well, we see 4 potential futures that could occur based on inclusionary policies or exclusionary policies, and sort of a dystopian future versus a utopian future. Most likely, we're going to play between these 2 models that Will Durant talked about, the pyramid model and the diamond-shaped model, with potentially neo-feudalism, where the rich have access to all the best technologies, longevity treatments and the best healthcare, and so forth, where the poor are excluded from that. But a better system, of course, is an inclusive system that uses technology to solve those problems of inequity. So we call this techno-socialism. So to wrap it up, why techno-socialism? Well, we need capitalism with a conscience. That's fairly clear. But technology can be deployed, if we have capitalism with a conscience, technology can be deployed to fix some of the most intractable problems humanity faces. The coronavirus is not the last crisis we're going to face that's going to radically change the way we think about economics and organising principles around society. The wave of artificial intelligence and technology based on employment and climate change, those are potentially worse in terms of scale of economic disruption than what we've seen with coronavirus. So if we don't start reorganising around this, then we risk the future. The main thing to understand here is that if we want a utopian, inclusive future, we want a positive future, then it's not going to be left to free market to come up with that result. We must plan and commit to that future as a society as a whole. And that's what we call techno-socialism. Thank you.